Right. Good morning. All right. We are beginning a short series this morning from Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. So if you have your Bibles, the real kind or electronic, turn to Philippians. Philippians it's only 4 chapters long, or it's 1,629 words in the original language in the Greek. Our students often write 1,500-word essays, so this is like an essay. So it's about 5 type pages, A4 size. And this is one of my favorite letters. It's a good read, easy read. But it can be deceiving because there's more to it than first meets the eye. In fact, it may be one of the most challenging letters that Paul has written, and he's written a lot of challenging things. He says in Philippians 2, verse 5, have the mind of Christ. Now, I don't know how much more challenging you can get than that. Have the mind of Christ. Paul, as he traveled the Mediterranean world, established these congregations of Jesus followers, those who gave their allegiance to King Jesus, not to Caesar, but to King Jesus. And his relationship with these churches was not always good. You just read the Corinthian letters, you can see there was an animosity there for a period of time. They didn't get along. It wasn't a great relationship between him and the Corinthians, but it's different here with the Philippian congregation. There was a warm mutual affection between Paul and this congregation here. Paul writes this letter and he uses friendship language all through this letter. He says things like, one soul, that's chapter 1, verse 27. Think the same things, chapter 2 and verse 2. Sharing gifts together back and forth, that's chapter 4, 10 and following. This language is friendship language, and so Paul writes as a friend to these people here. But Paul has some serious things to say to this congregation. Even though there was a good relationship between him, sorry about that, and this congregation, there are some serious things going on in this congregation. Now, maybe just an initial reading of the letter doesn't point that out, but the question of the future of, their survival is at stake here with what they're experiencing, both from without and also from within as well. So what does Paul want these Philippians to know? What does he want to say to them? And what does he want to say to us? Well, start with the city of Philippi. It was an interesting city. It was established in the 4th century BC, and a few years after it was established as a city, Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, incorporated that into his kingdom and changed the name to Philippi. That's where it gets its name. And later on, a century or so later, Rome was moving east and conquered this area and incorporated Philippi into its empire. And Philippi became a Roman colony after a while. When Rome was finished fighting its wars, when the great civil war between different Roman factions were ended, a lot of army veterans ended up in Philippi. They didn't want them to end up in Rome because they didn't want a lot of unemployed Roman soldiers ended up in Rome. Rome was too crowded anyway, and so they sent them to Philippi. So we have a lot of Roman soldiers, retired Roman soldiers in Philippi, and other Roman citizens. By the time we get to the 1st century, Philippi had many privileges, the same kind of privileges and the same kind of rights as the people from Rome did, as the citizens of Rome did. They had certain tax breaks. They could use Roman civil law. And also, if you were born in Philippi, you were considered a Roman citizen. Philippi became a Roman colony. So it was very Roman. All the inscriptions were written in Latin. As you made your way to the city of Philippi, you began seeing these mile markers written in Latin, not in Greek. The common people spoke Greek, but Rome had colonized this place and made it very Roman. In fact, the citizens of Philippi boasted that they were more Roman than Rome. All right? That's a boast. More Roman than Rome. So they're very proud to be connected with Rome and consider themselves as Roman citizens. The elite of the city were Roman citizens. They spoke Latin. And so now enters Paul in his travels, missionary travels. And he comes to Philippi. And you can read about the beginnings of the church in Acts chapter 16. And as Luke introduces the story of how the church began in the city of Philippi, he begins in verse 11 saying, "We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace. The following day to Neapolis." That was the port city there, and you would walk from Neapolis, I think it's about 10 miles, to Philippi. And from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. So Roman colony. And as he continues through the rest of chapter 16, talking about the establishing of the church there, he alludes to its Roman character in many different ways. When Paul was arrested, he was, it was charged against upsetting the Roman peace, political subversion. And this is the place where Paul pulls out of his back pocket his Roman citizenship card for the first time. He did that a few times in his travels. This is the first time. So it's very, very Roman. Even in Luke's account, he emphasizes that. So the beginning of the church, he has described the essential Roman character of the city. It's made up of primarily Gentiles. There was no synagogue there. And also a brewing conflict between the followers of King Jesus and Rome going on in Philippi. So Paul writes a letter. He needs to write a letter. And he needs to say some things to them. And because their future was at stake. The survival of his congregation was at stake. They had, like I said before, they had struggled from without, from the community in which they lived. Their environment was very hostile, but they also had problems internally as well that Paul needs to deal with. And so Paul writes a letter. And it's important to know, to understand really what Paul is saying, and more clearly understand what Paul is saying, and then how we can apply it to really what's going on in the letter. So we need to know something about the background, something about the history, something about the context to help us to hear more clearly, to know how we're to respond the way that God wants us to respond to this letter. So I have in my hand a letter. This is not from Paul, by the way, but a letter. I'm going to try to illustrate this. It's a one-page letter, handwritten. It's dated February of 1993. So it's almost as old as Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. Not quite. And it begins this way. "Dear Mary, how is everything in Michigan? Cold? It's definitely colder here than it was in California, and wetter. How is Greg doing? I sure wish I could be there. I'm praying for him. Well, I officially placed membership at Central Kitsap Church of Christ. Not only have we physically moved from place to place, but every time I do, I find a wonderful congregation where I grow spiritually. We will be buying a house in the area, so I'll be here for quite some time. The children's ministry here is great. Lakeisha loves her classes. A total of 4, 2 Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday. Now, they're committed, aren't they? I love everything about the church, this church. I've also become involved in WBS, World Bible School. This church was also involved in One Nation Under God. Please give my best to everyone. I miss you all. God bless, Kay. Now, what did you hear in this letter? What did you understand? Probably quite a bit. You can relate to it. It's a very simple letter. Just letting Mary know, and so who is the Mary that this letter is addressed to? Do you know? Mary Magdalene. Yeah, you probably guessed. Miss Mary right here. But she probably said some things in the letter that you don't know the background, you don't know the history, don't know the context. So when she says, "How is Greg doing?" it means nothing. She's concerned about someone named Greg. How is he doing? She mentions moving from California to place. California, where's that? We probably know where California is at. And where she's moving to, it's wetter than in California and colder. But because you probably don't know the context, the background, you don't fully understand what's being said, what's being communicated. And this is like in one nation under God. What is that? It's on U.S. currency, one nation under God, but she says involved in one nation under God. So again, without understanding the context, you hear this and it goes right over your head. And that somewhat illustrates how important it is when we read these letters of Paul in the New Testament, where it's like we're getting one side of a conversation. There's a conversation going on. We're only getting one side. And so to understand the letter, we need to, do some mirror reading, do some digging around. What's the background? What's going on? Because Paul is not just writing random things that come to his head. This sounds good. I think I'll throw it in. No, he's being very deliberate in what he says. He crafts what he says very carefully, and it's because what he has to say is very, very important. So it's important to know the context. So I want to kind of do that this morning to help us to hear the letter, because we're going to be doing some series of lessons from this letter of Paul to the Philippians. So I want you to picture in your mind a small church, about 40 or 50 people gathered together early on a Sunday morning, and there's excitement in this congregation as they gather together because they hear that Paul has finally heard from Paul. Finally. He sent a letter, and this letter is going to be read out. Now, back in the ancient world, when you read a letter out from someone, it's as if you were that person speaking. So it's like as if Paul was there speaking to them when they gather together, hear this letter being read. And this congregation is gathered together, but they're very anxious. They have a lot of anxiety because they had not known what happened to Paul. They heard that he was imprisoned, but they did not know his fate. So they were very concerned about Paul. And no news is not good news. And they weren't strong enough to be left on their own as orphans. They needed Paul. And so they had not known what happened to him. But now he sent a letter. And they were a minority group in this city that was proud to be Roman. But this group of Christians here, they had given their allegiance no longer to Caesar, but to King Jesus. And so they didn't look Roman. They didn't act Roman. They didn't even smell Roman. And you wouldn't find them down at the local temple dedicated to the Caesar to offer sacrifices to Caesar as Lord and Savior, as others would do. And nor would you find this small band of followers, you wouldn't find them participating in the local religious activities of the city. So they weren't being good citizens. And so they were viewed with suspicion by the community and even hostility. And so they must be antisocial. They must be disloyal. They're not good citizens. And so they were viewed with suspicion. And if you're not for us, you're against us. And so they were living in a hostile environment as well. So there is this church that has anxiety, living in a hostile environment. So they're gathered together on this Sunday morning as this anxious church, a suffering church. And in this assembly was one prominent lady in the congregation. Her name was Euodia. She was sitting on one side of this small house church. There was another prominent woman in this congregation sitting on the other side. Her name was Syntyche. So these two prominent women gathered together with the congregation this morning. Now, there's nothing significant about this one sitting on one side and one sitting on the other side, but they're not speaking to each other, or possibly they're not speaking to each other. All right? And then because they were having a disagreement with one another. They were not thinking the same like they should. And though the congregation was beginning to kind of take sides one of the other, so there was some turmoil, disharmony, disunity that was festering in the congregation. And that's worrying to Paul, because if the congregation doesn't stay together, it won't survive. It won't survive, especially living in this hostile environment. So Paul, the prisoner, knew he had a huge task and a challenge ahead of him. He knows he needs to address three things. And this is what we're going to be reading in the letter, these three things. First of all, he needs to alleviate their anxiety about his fate. and about what has happened to him. And so he does that. And because he says in verse 12 of chapter 1, I want you to know, beloved, I want you to know that what has happened to me. So he's going to give them information to alleviate their anxiety. He says has actually helped to spread the gospel. Second thing he needs to do here is to encourage the church that they need to stand firm. They need to have one mind. They need to be united. United we stand, divided we fall. They need to do that in the midst of their hostile environment. But if they don't do that, they won't survive. And then thirdly, he needs to somehow, in a very diplomatic way, address Euodia and Syntyche. They're not just your, quote, average member, unquote. They're prominent women. They're movers and shakers in the congregation. They're very influential. And so how they go with one another will determine how the church goes as well. So he needs to speak to these dear Christian sisters who had struggled alongside him for the gospel as well. He mentions that later on in chapter 4. So those are the three things he needs to do. So he writes this letter, and so this letter advances from one section to the next section, and he's addressing all these things. And one section builds. The following section builds on what he said previously. Like I said, he's crafted this letter very carefully, and it's important for us to take note of just how he says what he says. And so he begins with, after the greetings, he begins by exhorting them. So what he needs to do, this is part of his diplomatic approach. He needs to win a hearing. He needs to win an audience. He needs to get the church to be favorably disposed to hear what he has to say. Because what he has to say might be difficult to hear, might be difficult to do. And so he can't put a barrier between him and them. He has to open it up. So he has to win a hearing. He has to win their heart. He has to get them to be open to him and want to know what he has to say and want to do what he says they need to be doing. And so what he does in chapter 1, verse 3 through 11, he wins over an audience. He tells them that he thanks God for them. He remembers them, and he joyfully prays for them. He is concerned for them. He reminds them of their partnership or their fellowship in the gospel. And he says he longs for them, all these things. And so, they're sitting there, they're listening, they're saying, that's Paul. So this news warms their hearts. Possibly it puts smiles on their faces. Maybe it brings back good memories of when he was with them. And especially Euodia and Syntyche, who were his special partners in the gospel. They may have had a smile on his face, reminding them of all the good memories they had with Paul. And so he moves on from that. After gaining this audience, he moves on by narrating the things that recently happened to him, because that's what caused them to have anxiety. And so he tells them, look, I'm in prison, yes, but don't let that trouble you. He says, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. He says, what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel. And you've heard maybe that there's some brothers that are preaching and they're trying to slander me and put me down. And he says, that doesn't matter. Long as Jesus is preached, I can rejoice. And so Paul is alleviating their anxiety here. So he's not bitter. He rejoices. And so he wants them to know that, look, I'm in prison. That's not a good thing, but the gospel has been advancing. It's not a good thing that I'm being slandered by these brothers. He says, but at least Christ is being preached, and that's what I'm about. I'm on the mission. It's one mind, one mission. And so after he does that, he moves on. And he gets to the why I'm writing part. This is chapter 1, 27 through 30. This is like the thesis of the letter. All right, this is his primary purpose or goal in writing. And he says in verse 27, he says, only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one soul or one spirit. That one soul is a friendship word, and to the ancient Greeks, friends were two souls friends were, scratch that, friends were two bodies with one soul. So, striving, he says, in one spirit and one soul, striving side by side, and that's that military term. All right, striving side by side. The Roman army, they strove, they side by side, they worked together against the common enemy. Striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and are no way intimidated by your opponents. The way they cannot be intimidated by their opponents if they are strong. And the reason they can be strong is that they are of the same mind. They share this same soul. So unity is not an option. It's necessary for their survival. You cannot survive on your own. Faith needs to be nourished. We nourish it when we're with brothers and sisters and they nourish our faith. There's a sense of unity and common purpose. Because their mission requires them one mind for one mission. Their own one mission. The mission of announcing the good news of Jesus. That Jesus is the King of the universe, not Caesar. And so this is the thesis of the letter. They need to get their mojo. They need to find their mojo again. They need to start thinking and acting as one soul in many different bodies. And so they're sitting there listening to this, and there sits Euodia on one side, and there sits Syntyche on the other side, and they're looking around the room and glancing and thinking, yes, we need to be one. And then their eyes meet each other for a moment, and then they quickly look back up at the reader reading the letter to them. So that's eye contact they made was only a glance. So having stated his main purpose, he goes on and to talk about how they can have this one mind. This is where the challenge lies here. Chapter 2, 1 through 4, 1. So how can they have this unity? Because when they do, they will shine like stars. That's what he says later on. They will shine like stars in their dark world. So Paul is pulling out his big guns now. He gathers his best thoughts together, the thoughts that he's been thinking about for a while, and now Paul musters all he has to make his case in a way that will not just state what is right, but that will motivate them to do what they need to do in order to have the unity they need to have in order to be strong against their hostile environment. Because their hostile environment will eat them alive if they're not one. They're not unified. And so he talks about one mind they need to have. And the one mind is Jesus. So Jesus is the ultimate example. And of course, he's the template as well. Jesus, the mind of Jesus, he was in the form of God, but he emptied himself. He emptied himself all the way to death on a cross, and then God exalted him. That's the pattern. That's the pattern. And then he uses the example of Timothy and Epaphroditus, two of people they know very well. They are two that exemplify this mind that the Philippians are supposed to have. And then Paul uses himself as an example as well there. And then as he concludes the letter, this is Euodia and Syntyche. I don't know. You may have seen this before. This has been around for a while, this photo here. I get a long shirt. Anyway, this powerful letter ends with a personal appeal, and that's beginning in chapter 4, verse 2. So up to this point, Euodia and Syntyche, they began to squirm. They began to squirm in their seats. Their hearts began to race. They began to perspire because they're beginning to think, is he talking about me? Have you ever been in that situation where the preacher was preaching and you're thinking, he's preaching just to me? You ever thought that, felt that? What does he know, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. But when I was a kid, I was on the front row with the preacher's grandson. And we were having a good time. The grandfather, James Medford, was preaching. And Pat and myself were having a good time in the front row. And right in the middle of his sermon, he called out my name and his name, and he says, David, Pat, what are we doing up there? I don't know. He got our attention. He says, if you guys don't behave, I'm going to send you back to your parents. Well, we behaved after that, but it's not a fun thing to be called out publicly. So here in this letter, Paul's been talking about these kind of things all along, and so we get to chapter 4 and verse 2. Euodia and Syntyche, sitting on different sides of the house, they're hearing these things. They're beginning to feel a little uncomfortable, and then all of a sudden the reader is reading, and he says in verse 2, I begged Euodia, and I begged Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, whoever the loyal companion might have been, help these women. Help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. So, Paul includes their name in this letter, and their name is immortalized in this letter. And people through the centuries, have heard about Euodia and Syntyche. We don't know what their disagreement was. We don't know, but they were not of the same mind. And this entire letter has really prepared them for this moment. And the community is hearing this too, because the community is involved with this. Because disunity is a threat to the survival of this community, and their disagreement is threatening the congregation as well. So it's not just a little thing. So if you were there, what would you tell these ladies to do? What would you tell these ladies to do? Well, I would say, I don't know, I would say they need to pray. Euodia and Syntyche, you need to pray for each other. Euodia and Syntyche, you should give each other the benefit of the doubt. You should put yourselves in the other's sandals and see it from their perspective, from their point of view. You should listen to the wisdom of your fellow believers, and you should seek out their wisdom. You should have a mind, a heart, an attitude to want to work these things out, to want to work things out. You should work to forgive one another. And you need to remember that the other is striving to live out their faith faithfully like you are. I don't know, that's some things that they probably need to hear, and maybe we should tell them. And then that's us. It applies to us too. So this Philippi was possibly the first congregation of Jesus' followers on European soil, possibly. It began in the middle of struggles. You read Acts chapter 16. But the survival of this very important church, this strategic congregation, it hinged on these brothers and sisters living out their identity as united followers of a crucified Jewish Messiah. Messiah who emptied himself for their sake and for the sake of the world. And it is their unity, which was created by the story of Jesus, that will give them the power to be strong and to survive their hostile environment. And that's our story as well. Our environment today is very different, but often our society is hostile to our way of life as followers of Jesus. It definitely offers us alternative allegiance than Jesus. We have to deal with a lot of issues today, and they're not easy to deal with. And our survival depends on us being together as one people. And I'm not saying we're not. I think congregation is doing very well in that, but things can change quickly. We know that. Let me just offer you these things here. We have to not just tolerate one another, but live in harmony. Not just live in harmony, but have the same mind. That doesn't mean just think exactly alike, but have a reason we will want to be one, want to move forward together. Have the same kind of reason that leads to behavior that gives life and that leads to healthy relationships. And so here are some thoughts we can end with. When we disagree, sit on the same side of the table as the other and listen to them. And when church conflict arises, there's different ways we can respond to that. Respond with heaps of humility. Not often as the default with gossip or withdrawal or choosing sides, but heaps of humility. And often we can end up feeling isolated. But we need to remember that it's not about us. This is a hard thing. It's not about us. It's about Him. It's about a shared story, a shared purpose, a shared mission that we each have, that we each signed up for and became followers to live out the story of Jesus. Because we're going to live out His story, not our story. And then when our culture pressures us, it's easy to respond with hostility. It's easy to respond with a divisive language. It's easy to respond, with hostility. But we need to respond, with conviction, with courage, but also with love. With love. So this small letter of Paul is calling us to be a group of Jesus followers here in Otomotai, to have one mind with one mission, to live out this uniting story of Jesus in a world that's very hostile and a very divided world. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to one another, we owe it to God, and we owe it to our world to be this way. God bless you. Let's pray.